Welcome to this series exploring innovation, progress and achievement using a technocentric paradigm by Ash Stuart.
You may want to also read Ash's original Substack article for the best experience, including footnotes and other details.
Episode 25, Part A. 1 step for man, 3 giant leaps for mankind. When mobile marvels meet marble mansions. In some of the writing in this and other series here, see notes, we have mentioned the role of competition while discussing innovation. And further in episode 19 and episode 20, we looked at the role of adversity in not so much directly innovation per se, but how it could undo past innovation and achievement. Let's now explore the opposite. Cases where adversity might have spurred innovation alongside competition. Along the way, we'll also explore 2 other extraordinarily influential civilizations in continuation with one extraordinarily influential one. We looked in some depth at 10 episodes ago, but not civilizations as we are accustomed to define that word.
Let's go back briefly to the Indus Valley in the year 2200 BC, when that civilization was at its height. How lofty the heights were, you can find in episode 19 if you haven't read that yet. From that mature stage, in 2200 BC, this civilization's steep decline was set in motion by about 1900 BC. I discussed in Seasons That Swing, episode 21, the climatic events that correlate with this. A severe cooling and aridification set in large parts of Eurasia, coinciding with a great many civilizational upheavals. In the Eurasian steppes, this period is also notable for some remarkable developments. But unlike inducing decline, as happened in the Indus Valley, the trajectory is quite the reverse. Don't get me wrong. At the onset of the massive climatic changes in the century of 2200 BC, there were bigger and more rapid civilizational upheavals in the Near East. It's a testament, indeed, to the resilience of the Indus people that their mature civilization persisted until about 1900 before the beginning of their decline.
A bespoke revolution.
In the Eurasian steppes, the hinted-at developments center around 2 extraordinary artifactual and institutional innovations and relates to the emergence of a new group of people and culture that would dominate Central Asia for more than 2 millennia and culminate in the formation of the ethno-linguistic cultures and religions of Persia and India, a lot of elements of which persist to this day. Let's start with the artifactual developments. I will come to the institutional technologies later. We have seen in the long-read episode on the aforehinted Proto-Indo-Europeans the vital importance of horses as one of the elements that led to that group's emergence between 3300 to 2800 BC as a powerful force on the Eurasian steppes that expanded later into India, Europe, and more. And around 2200 to 2100 BC emerges a key update to some of the innovations of the PIE folk I discussed there. This is the invention of the chariot. And not just that, but perhaps more importantly, the spoked wheel. We discussed that the PIE folk had wagons that gave them mobility and were essentially ox-driven. Can you imagine how much more agility and mobility was made possible by the invention of the spoked wheel chariot? In our episode on the wheel, episode 13, I explored the intellectual leap that made possible the conceptualization of the wheel and, importantly, its practical implementation. This first contraption, literally the first revolution, was a solid wheel made initially of wood. This brand new spoked wheel, which is invented more than 1,000 years later, certainly was even more revolutionary. I mean, placing oneself in the epistemological mindset of the time before the spoked wheel. Similar to our exercise there around the original wheel, it's hard to even imagine how the idea of creating spokes on a thin circular rim when all you are used to is one solid circle came about. Let's remember, this was a pre-literate people, and even those who had writing in pre-modern times did not have the diagrammatic and notational techniques we today take for granted. But yes, it happened. We have archaeological remains, high-status burials from about 2100 BC in and around a place called Sintashta in the southern Urals, where chariots, alongside other important items such as weapons, have been found buried with important individuals.
The wheels have turned.
But what got them into inventing this much more complicated artifact when, in the eyes of most folk with the tendency to take things as they've always been, the solid wheel did, well, a solid job? And then to go on to invent the chariot, which in its spoked, two-wheeled glory had to be immeasurably superior to the clunky solid wheel wagons of old. But it doesn't stop there. We see from archaeogenetic studies that these developments coincide with the emergence into prominence of a specific species of horse, scientifically named Equus cavalis, which is said to be much more docile, but bigger and stronger, and thus more rider-friendly than any that existed before. So much so that all subsequent horse species are solely and entirely from this lineage.
As opposed to, say, the bow-tie horses we've previously mentioned in our episode on horses, episode 12.
And these remarkable innovators are who we call the Proto-Indo-Iranians, ancestors of the Indic and Iranic peoples who then settled those southern areas as mentioned. A small group of the Indo-Aryans even went west to Anatolia. These are, in their own self-designation, the Aryans. Arya in Rigvedic, and giving the name of the country of Iran, land of the Aryans. We first met in episode 9 while discussing fire, a key element of their identity.
Faring far and wide with fire.
With the Sintashta complex being the point of emergence of the Proto-Aryans, in the centuries that followed, they expanded into a vast tract of territory in the Central Asian steppe from the southern Urals to western Xinjiang, now China, and down to modern-day Tajikistan and Uzbekistan in the south, not far from Afghanistan. When we look at the archaeology of the Sintashta sites, we get a few more clues how this happened. There are several fortified settlements revealing industrial-scale metallurgy, rivaling contemporary Near Eastern civilizations. We've seen that the Sintashta period coincides with the time of cooling and aridification in what's known as the 4.2 kiloyear event, as already referenced. The Sintashta culture, and perhaps more so its preceding cultures such as the Abhishavo, can be associated with high degree of internecine warfare and struggle for resources, as reflected in the predominance of military artifacts unearthed in the archaeology, not to mention the heavily fortified settlements of sites such as Sintashta itself. But all of this was in the Bronze Age. Let's now fast forward to another climatic event I've also referenced in detail and discussed in episode 20, as part of the Bronze Age collapse and how the current story further evolves.
The third note of triumph.
For this is the next stage of such examples of leaps of innovation in the steppes, the next generation, after the Proto-Indo-Europeans and the Proto-Indo-Iranians, so to speak. Around 1000 BC or so, we see the emergence of another very powerful group that continues these horse-based innovations to its next peak, one that's perhaps better known than these two cultural, linguistic, and genetic predecessors. These are what are known to history as the Scythians. These innovations are around mastery of military-grade horseback riding and, more impressively, horse-mounted archery. In the centuries that follow, and in particular with the emergence of ancient or classical Greece, unlike their two predecessors, the Scythians make their way into history, mentioned by Herodotus, among others later. Let's pause to consider how amazing these innovations were. We saw in episode 12 that it was challenging enough to domesticate the horse, an animal much bigger than man, but to be able to zip through enemy lines, shooting out arrows while still riding the horse at high speed. How long would it take you and me to accomplish such a feat? There are cases of horse-mounted archery prior to the Scythians, but these were two men where one was riding and the other was shooting. But with the Scythians, it was the same guy doing both. But let's not overlook two other Scythian innovations that might seem mundane, but were utterly revolutionary for mounted warfare. To master horse-mounted archery, you need to stay firmly seated while drawing a powerful bow and controlling your mount. Try doing that bareback. The Scythians developed sophisticated saddles with padded bolsters and felt cushioning that provided stable shooting platforms without the stirrups that wouldn't be invented for another millennium. But maybe here's the fun part. They invented trousers. Yes, what we take for granted were a Scythian innovation born of pure necessity. Try riding a horse wearing an elaborate toga or a sari. Flowing robes and bare legs don't mix well with galloping horses and combat maneuvers. These fitted leather and wool trousers, often reinforced at stress points, became so associated with horse-riding peoples that sedentary populations, who stuck to their draped tunics and togas, came to see trousers as the mark of the quote-unquote barbarian. It might have pleased the curtain merchants and bedsheet sellers of Greece, Rome, and elsewhere, but little did such civilized people know they were looking at cutting-edge technology, well, surely well-cut tailoring, designed for maximum mobility and protection. Another key innovation here was the development of advanced composite bows made from laminated wood, horn, sinew, and glues. According to historical sources, Scythian archers are said to be capable of shooting 10 to 12 arrows per minute, accurately, at ranges exceeding half a kilometer. It is said that these composite bows took 1 to 2 years of manufacturing time and integrated multiple material sciences. These Scythian bows represented the apex of pre-gunpowder technology, obviously widely emulated by later peoples including the Parthians, Mongols, and the Turks. The famous Parthian shot, in fact, originated among the Scythians. So yes, this once again revolutionized warfare, and stories abound of the terror the Scythians inspired in many of the sedentary populations of the ancient Near East and other areas bordering the Eurasian steppes, eventually going right as deep inland as Thrace and modern-day Hungary.
A twist in the tale.
But here's the problem. While there are many accounts of the exploits of the Scythians, these have all been written by others, specifically sedentary populations such as the Greeks. Even though the aforementioned Herodotus is seen as the father of history, there are, from a modern perspective, severe historiographical shortcomings in his accounts of such outsiders. The main issue here is that not only were these people writing from their own perspectives, their own fears, their own agendas, but as sedentary populations, they had very little idea of life in the steppe, leading to a significant amount of distortion from their ideological and practical viewpoints. And this is what I seek to redress here. This is perhaps all the more important because what I have covered above by way of the artifactual achievements of the steppe peoples, in particular the Proto-Indo-Iranians and the Scythians, is not so great as the institutional technologies. So let's look at what these institutional innovations were, much of which historians, and not just the ancients, seem to have glossed over. The story is not over. We will complete this trilogy. Stick around.